All right. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. I know there's some other folks who will probably be joining us, but I will take care of it on that end. But I really want to welcome you to the Community Offering Series. For those who don't know me, my name is Larissa Wall, and I am the Assistant Director of Community Engagement at B'nai Jeshurun. I am currently on the West Coast, where it is much warmer than in New York. So I hope you are enjoying your weather and hope it cools off for all of us soon. It is really my pleasure to welcome together Jennifer Hirsch and David Lieberman for our program this evening. We've been offering over the past month or so a series of community offerings to showcase some of our community members who have skills to share. So really excited that you could be here with us. We have, I believe, 2 more in the series that were just added, which you can find information on online, and you can also ask me if you have any questions about those. So I'm going to introduce both Jennifer and David, share a little bit about how Q&A will work, and then we'll get started. So Jennifer Hirsch is a professor of socio-medical sciences at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health and co-author with Seamus Khan of the recent book, Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, published by W.W. Norton. That work was realized as part of Columbia's Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, or SHIFT, co-directed by Jennifer and clinical psychologist Claude and Mellons. Some of you may recall seeing SHIFT profiled by Gia Tolentino in The New Yorker in February of 2018. And a recent review of Science describes Sexual Citizens as profoundly eye-opening. Jennifer is also an active participant in Panim's social justice activities and the mother of Isaac and Jacob Santelli, who became B'nai Mitzvah here at BJ. Isaac was also an active participant in BJ's teen program. We are delighted to welcome Jennifer to our shared community for a conversation about campus sexual assault and what all of us can do to prevent it. And David, who has the honor of interviewing Jennifer this evening, has been a BJ member since 1986 and has been working part-time in B'nai Jeshurun's youth and family program since 2005 as a Hebrew school teacher, teen educator, and B'nai Mitzvah tutor. As part of his work with the BJ teens, he has facilitated Moving Traditions Shevet Brotherhood program for 10 years and has helped train hundreds of other men to mentor teens through Moving Tradition training seminars. In addition to his work as a Jewish educator, David is an Emmy-winning documentary film and television editor. And before we begin, it's important to note that our discussion of Sexual Citizens will contain descriptions of actual sexual assaults as students experience them. This material can be hard to listen to, and we know that in every room, virtual or not, there are survivors. I'll drop the RAIN hotline number in the chat window. Please take care of yourselves and know that you are not alone. I will post that in just a minute. And just in terms of the questions, if you have questions throughout, feel free to chat them directly, privately to me, and I will make sure they get to David so that he can ask them of Jennifer. And now I will turn it over to David and Jennifer.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me? We're good? Testing? Excellent.
We're good.
I'm so glad to have an opportunity to talk with you about this book. I've read it over the last couple of weeks, and I thought it was profoundly moving and really opened up some new ideas to me on this topic. And so I thought we'd start at the beginning, and I wanted to ask you how you came to write this book.
Well, I'll open with a story, and then I'll back up and give you a little bit of a sense of where the story came from. So Austin was what you would describe as a kind of menschy guy. The one steamy sex scene in the book is Austin and his girlfriend on a hot summer night. I'm not going to describe that now, sorry. But he was the kind of guy who had nicknames for the kinds of orgasms that his girlfriend had. So he was sweet, and his story really touched us. But part of the story was very troubling. He recounted an evening freshman year when he was in a room with a girl. It wasn't his room, it was his roommate's girlfriend's room. He had been sort of shuffled over there so the roommate and the girlfriend could be alone together. When he went in, the girl said, she was really drunk, and she said, "I don't want to do anything." And yet he got in bed with her, and he started to touch her body. And, so that's an assault. And then he stopped himself. And in the interview, We asked students, not labeling things, so, you know, tell us about an awesome sexual experience you had and tell us about something that was hard or confusing. And he described that evening, and then he paused, and I'm going to use the language that students use in the interviews. So, you know, it's also the language I frequently use in conversation. But so he paused and he said, fuck me. When, like, he came to the realization of what he had done, he had never been able to bring himself to label that. And so Sexual Citizens is about what we can do to prevent things like that from happening. He was anxious. He felt like all of his peers had more sexual experience than he did. He thought about sex as something to have rather than something to share. And Sexual Citizens is about prevention. It's about how we can raise young people so that they're less likely to commit assaults. Nobody wants their son to do what Austin did, or their daughter, and how we can organize our communities in ways that make assaults far less likely. In 2014, as I was observing the national conversation about campus sexual assault, it was a moment when people were watching The Hunting Ground and talking about predators and focused on how to improve campus adjudication processes. But what was missing was a consideration of how the environment produces that behavior. I thought, you know, this is what I've done my whole career for 3 decades. I've looked at how we need to not work one penis at a time. We need to think about changing the context. And so in Sexual Citizens, we map out what the context is. And sorry, that's my home phone. I don't know how to make that go away. It's very real, right?
It's real.
It's real. It's real. We're all
the new reality.
Yes. Anyway, so that's what we're doing in the book. We're mapping out the context and looking at how we can build safer communities.
I think one of the things that I love about the book is, and it's emblematic of the book, is it was also included in the way you answered that question, which is the book is full of stories, you know, true, personal, intimate stories from college students. And I'm wondering how did you get access to all of this information, to all these stories? It's a really sort of powerful way that you build your case and you explore the problem. So what was that like, gathering those stories?
So I think the experience of reading the book, it pulls back the curtain for people who are not college students about what it's like to be a student in residential higher education today. As Larissa noted, the research that we did for Sexual Citizens was part of a much bigger project funded by the university that had a survey and worked with the administrators. But most of the work that we describe in Sexual Citizens, it's what it involves a deep immersion in students' daily lives. So Seamus and I are too old to hang around with college students socially, and like that would be super creepy. And I mean, I go to bed at 9:30 every night, so like they're still in the library at 9:30. So we hired a team of younger researchers. They weren't like undercover ever. They always introduced themselves as researchers, and together the 7 of us interviewed 151 students. For all those students, the first interview was between 1.5 hours and 2 hours, but some students had experienced so many assaults that they came back for a second or even a third interview. So we had a diverse sample of students representing the Columbia and Barnard undergraduate student bodies. What really distinguishes Sexual Citizens from other work that people have done on campus sexual assault is that our research team spent time hanging out with the students. So whether they were riding the bus up to Baker Field or going to craft for Shabbat services or in a fraternity party or in the library or in the cafeteria, they spent time alongside students seeing how they lived their daily lives. We spoke with students in groups and then we spoke with some students and some administrators who were sort of experts on students' lives. If you think about the kind of most sexual assault prevention, which is a good effort, is focused on consent, right? And in the book, we use the metaphor of driving a lot. So consent is sort of like the stop sign. And yes, to learn to drive, it is important to stop at stop signs. But you can't teach someone to drive by only teaching them to stop at stop signs. You have to teach them all of the complicated behaviors that are involved in getting safely from where you are to where you want to go. And so imagine we have a whole system set up to teach people to do what is a pretty dangerous thing, which is get in a 2-ton vehicle and move around the world. And we don't have that same system for sex. So basically, most kids are a little bit on their own, and their parents, if they talk about it at all, the message they give is not under my roof, which is not a helpful message. It doesn't teach people, it doesn't teach young people if they have the right to say yes when they want to have sex. And so it also doesn't prepare them well to either say no or to listen when someone else says no.
Yeah, and what I hear a lot of, at least in my education, when I talk to young people about what their sex education has been like, it's been a lot of, well, don't get STDs and don't get pregnant, but nothing about like, what do we do, and what are ways that we can make for satisfactory, healthy sexual experiences that can grow us as people and as partners. And I really appreciate the level of detail and the intimacy of the stories. That's one of the commonalities between my work that I do in filmmaking and also with the BJ teens, and when I train people to mentor boys, is thinking about like the sharing of personal stories and the power that has. Because not only when you listen to it, you understand the person you're speaking with in a new way, but I think the storyteller has to then sort of examine their behavior and maybe sees themselves in a different light. And you can sort of see that happening to a couple of your subjects in real time in the book, where they are working through this sexual experience and they realize, oh my God, like I treated my partner like they weren't a human, or I took my personal space and my personal liberties for granted. So it's such a powerful tool. And so I, as an educator, I really enjoyed reading this book. And I know that there are a lot of parents on this chat, of students of mine and PJ parents, but who else did you write this book for?
So yes, for parents, and just a note for parents. I mean, I think that, I share this with other parents with a great deal of humility as a mom, honestly, who can't get her courage up to teach her son to drive. So like, if your kids want to talk about porn or masturbation, send them to me, but I cannot do the driving thing. And I think that it's hard to be a parent, and the last thing that we need is someone else telling us that there are things that we've failed at. So that's the second group for whom I wrote this book, is faith communities. First young people, second parents, but third faith communities, because I think, the way that you have been there for so many kids in our community who don't feel that they can talk to their parents, or whose parents don't really feel that they can talk with them. And so I think that there is an important values formation role that faith communities can do. I think, it's a pretty low bar to say that religious institutions, what they have to do in relation to sexual assault is be safe spaces where kids aren't assaulted. I think like if the whole point of religion is to form human beings, then we should be providing an opportunity. We want them to stand under the chuppah someday, right? And begin or continue formalize a relationship with someone. Sex is going to be part of that. And if the only message they ever get is that it's a dirty, rotten, nasty thing, that doesn't prepare them well. So I think that the role that religious institutions can play in preparing them for that transition to adulthood really can't be overstated.
Absolutely. I'm wondering if you could, for the folks who haven't maybe read the book yet, talk about sort of the three big ideas, the big three frameworks that are operating in the book: sexual citizens, sexual geographies, and sexual projects. If you could explain what those are and how they sort of all play into this campus sexual assault.
Yeah, so the three main ideas, and I promise, like, this book is really written for all of you. This is, Seamus and I deliberately did not write a book for academics because then it would only be read by other academics. And this is too important to only share in the research community. We really want this to be a book that gives people, parents, children, educators, a new language for thinking about sex, both in relation to sexual assault and also more generally. So sexual citizenship is the idea that people have the right to choose their own sexual experiences and the understanding that other people have those same rights. Sexual projects answers the question of what is sex for, which you might think is sort of an absurd question because, like, of course sex is to have babies and for pleasure, but most college students are not having babies, and a lot of college sex is actually not that pleasurable. And so in the book, we lay out the many other reasons or things that young people hope to achieve through sex. And then sexual geographies is the ways that space shapes sexual experiences. So I'll tell you a story that illustrates how those three things fit together. And this is sort of, in some ways, the classic campus sexual assault story that all of you may think of when you think of a campus sexual assault. So Lucy was a freshman, and she was so excited to start college. She had gone to boarding school. She'd been very sheltered. She wanted to party. She wanted to make out with boys. She wanted to lose her virginity. She and her friend Nancy went to a bar. It's really, really easy to get into a bar when you're an 18-year-old woman in Morningside Heights. And they were psyched. Some senior guys were chatting them up. Scott, after buying Lucy a couple of drinks, asked if she wanted to go back to the fraternity with him. She did. So they stumbled up Amsterdam Avenue in the warm summer night. Her phone rang and rang. It was Nancy, who wanted to catch up with her because she had taken that bystander training and she wanted to keep an eye on her friend. And so Scott wasn't super psyched about it, but he waited outside the frat and he invited both girls, because girls is how men speak to women on the campus. So he invited both girls inside with him, and they went up the stairs and he offered them drinks. The drinks are on the second floor because you can't keep alcohol, you can't keep hard alcohol on the first floor. And so they're now on the second floor of a building they've never been in, surrounded by people they don't know, all of whom are 2 or 3 years older than they are. And Nancy passes out immediately. And then Scott invites Lucy up to his room, and she wants to go. So she climbs up to the third floor now and goes into his bedroom with him. And they start making out. And like up until this point, it's all good. She's like, thinks she's living the dream. And then he starts to unbutton her pants. And she says, no, don't, stop. And he says, it's okay. And then he raped her. And so like, in what universe is the response to no, don't, it's okay? Because it wasn't okay. And so he wasn't seeing her as a sexual citizen. He was thinking about sex as something to have. His sexual project was just acquiring more sexual experience or having his own sexual pleasure. He wasn't thinking about her really as a self-determining person. But the role of space is so powerful there because they were in a space that he controlled. And, you know, there's one take on the story. You could think, okay, Scott is a sociopath, right? And that doesn't, like, fine, maybe he is, but that doesn't lead us to any solution. Another way to hear that story is to actually try to hold some compassion or at least understanding for Scott, that like maybe he was really unaware of the fact that being 3 years older and 40 pounds heavier in a room, in a building where he was surrounded by people who knew him and would back him up, literally was silencing to Lucy, made her unable to do anything except give up when he said it's okay. So I think a big take home from the book is how all of those different ideas fit together so that people who are not necessarily bad people can end up doing things that are very harmful to their peers.
I think one of the things I noticed about that story is that you were talking about the first floor, they couldn't drink, so they go up to the second floor, and then the third floor where the assault happens. The idea that there are these spaces that college campuses have created spaces not intending to do harm to students, but there's a sort of a hierarchy that gets reflected in these spaces that can lead to harm. Can you talk a little bit about these sexual geographies and how they play out on campuses, and maybe what we can do to sort of shift, you know, to put an intervention there, like spatially?
Yeah, I think that the biggest signal to higher education administrators in the book is about those sexual geographies, because that, as anyone who's ever been in an academic context knows, space is power. And so the campus is set up so that, and I don't think this is inadvertent, but it's sort of the way multiple policies intertwine, so that students who are men, because sororities don't serve alcohol, and are older because older students get better space, and are wealthier because it's expensive to be in a fraternity. So older, wealthier men end up controlling the spaces in which parties can happen. The university regulates access to hard alcohol, and so to protect their institution, fraternity members move the alcohol where it can't be found by the institution. And so all of these factors combine to create access to better spaces by more powerful students. But universities could undo that. They could create housing where first-year students and queer students and students of color and women have space where they can host parties. So it's not about abolishing the finals clubs at Harvard or the eating clubs at Princeton or the fraternities at all the other schools. It's about creating alternative spaces where students are not sort of impelled into those spaces where there are such vast power disparities. And I think it's also about helping young men see how powerful they are. Many 19 or 20-year-old men don't feel so powerful in the world. And they think, well, I would never assault anyone because I'm not a bad person. And so helping them see that power, see the ways in which social advantage can make them vulnerable to assaulting someone, could teach them to check themselves a little bit.
I think also when I'm thinking about dorm rooms and at least my experience in college, a lot of freshmen, a lot of younger students are in rooms, shared rooms. They don't have a lot of privacy, a lot of access to that space. And so when you're being intimate with someone early on for the first time and you don't know what you like or what they like, or you're being very vulnerable, the fact that you don't really have the space or enough time in that space to really explore in a way that's, relaxed and safe, I think adds a lot of pressure, a pressure of time, a pressure of like, are we going to get caught? Or what are my roommates are outside and they're going to see this guy, leave victorious from the room or not. And so I think that really that was a fascinating and new piece of this to me, really thinking about how space can influence these kinds of incidents and decisions that people are making.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many stories in the book where younger students end up in spaces controlled by older students because younger students don't have singles. And so just even like the access to a single room becomes part of the social context of vulnerability, which could be remade.
Yeah, and I think we have an opportunity now. We're looking at what is higher education going to look like after COVID, and I think there is an opportunity to rethink some of these things that have been set in stone for so long about what campuses look like, what student housing looks like. I'm wondering what things in your research surprised you? Was there anything that really?
I mean, I think two things. One, it was it took some practice to learn to see men being assaulted as assault, because I think whether it was and particularly to see heterosexual assault as assault, because and even for some of the men, they described it and they're like, this was a weird thing that happened to me, and they didn't label it as assault. They sort of took the penis to be a barometer of desire, and they figured if they had an erection, it had to have been what they wanted to do. But I think another thing that was not what we had intended to write about, but ultimately it ends up being a very important theme in the book, is the role of race in sexual assault. And I mean, in one sense, if you live in America, and you know the history of slavery, how could sexual assault in America ever not be about race, right? Mm-hmm. But every single Black woman that we spoke with had experienced unwanted, non-consensual sexual touching, every single one. And so that just underlines that you can't think about sexual assault only in relation to gender as a form of power. You have to also think about racial domination, because those assaults are not going to be prevented by yakking at students for 60 minutes about consent. Those assaults are about the lack of respect for the bodies of people of color. Many of the young men that we spoke with revealed a fear of being falsely accused, but the way that Black men spoke about their fear was really qualitatively different. One young man, for example, told us a story of a girl who was kind of into him at a party, but she seemed too drunk, and he didn't like to have sex drunk with women because it didn't feel safe to him. And I mean, again, that is something that we never heard a white man say, oh, it doesn't feel safe to me. And so he went for a walk with her, and they walked around till like, 2 in the morning, and she still seemed too drunk. So they went back to his room and they talked for a while, and eventually they had sex. And then he recorded her saying that she'd had a good time. And he recounted to us that he had looked it up, and he knew that New York was a one-party consent state for recordings being done without the other person's consent being admissible as evidence. And he was afraid that as a white woman, she would change her mind and he would have no ground to stand on, because he assumed that the deck would be stacked against him. So that was very sort of poignantly expressed the precarity that so many Black men experienced on campus. You can't separate their sexual experience from their social experience of feeling marginalized and less powerful.
And can you also speak a little bit about class? I know there was a story that really struck me about a woman who ended up hooking up with someone way far away from campus, and then, didn't really have the funds to take an Uber home or a Lyft home, and ended up staying there when she didn't want to. So what other ways does class play into this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the charisma story illustrates both the sexual geography and the sort of racial topography of campus. She didn't feel like there were, as many women of color, she didn't feel like there was a dating pool on campus really for women like her, because there were so few men of color, and white men just tended not to be interested in Black women in particular. And so she'd been chatting with this guy, and they made a plan eventually for her to go out to his place in Brooklyn. And from the beginning, it felt to her like the evening was going to be a little bit of a disaster. It rained, the subway was the weekend, so subway repairs, and took her hours to get to his place. And she finally got there. And as she said to us, she hadn't been planning to have sex. She hadn't shaved her legs or brought a toothbrush, and she was wearing granny panties. And so like all evidence of how much she had not been thinking this was going to go in that direction. And they started making out, and then he started to touch her genitals, and she moved his hand away, and he put his hand back. And she said, I didn't have a plan B, that her way of stopping sex when she didn't want to have it had always been body language, and he was not responsive to her body language. And so he assaulted her that night and again in the morning. And she couldn't just flip open her phone. I mean, people don't use flip phones, but she couldn't just open up her phone and call an Uber, because it was at least a $60 ride back to campus. And so the combination of a sort of social organization of dating that made her feel sort of ejected from campus in the first place, and then the wealth inequality that meant that she couldn't just hop in a cab and come home. She was very vulnerable in that moment. And I think then she was rendered additionally vulnerable by, and this is not to say that it was her fault, but I think we underprepare young people by not helping them figure out a plan B when plan A doesn't work. One of the papers from the survey research that was part of this bigger project showed that women students who'd had sex education that included teaching them how to say no to sex they didn't want to have, which is not abstinence-only sex education. It's just like basically good sex education that includes skills development to deal with awkward situations. Those women were half as likely to be raped in college. So that's a really powerful impact. It's basically, everyone is saying now, get the flu shot, right? It's about as effective as the flu shot. And so, we have a tool that could help us get to herd immunity for sexual assault. And yet there's this crazy national patchwork where, like in New York State, which you think might be a blue state, actually there's no mandated sex ed. So I think, Charisma's vulnerability in that moment, he should have listened to her he should have paid attention when she moved his hand away. And also her community had failed her by not preparing her better for that moment.
Absolutely. I have a question in the chat I want to throw to you. How many of these assaults happen under the influence of drugs and or alcohol? And are there suggestions for how to deal with that?
Alcohol is definitely a risk factor in the survey research, which is similar to what other survey research has found. A substantial proportion, so maybe about half, happened under the influence of drugs or alcohol. I think an important place to start when you think about drinking and sex is to acknowledge that, like, I don't know if you've ever been to a bar, but it's a pretty normal thing that adults do is combine alcohol and sex, right? Many of us may not even have been conceived if it weren't for a little alcohol and sex. So I think that to pathologize the combination is to like do something to kids that we don't, to judge on people in a way that we don't judge ourselves. And at the same time, I think that there are reasons that young people drink related to sex that are really problematic. One young woman told us that she had to get drunk before she hooked up because it was like Novocaine before the dentist, that she was so uncomfortable with sex. And again, like, we did that, right? We made her, all those shaming messages that people get, that's what produces that feeling of discomfort. So there's, I mean, there's many other things I could say about alcohol and sex. I think that one message, knowing that most sexual assaults are committed by men, we need to do a much better job, not of yakking at women about how being drunk makes them vulnerable to being assaulted, but of telling our sons that when they combine alcohol and sex, because they're not paying close attention to their partner, because they're, as the kids say, thinking with their little head and not their big one, they're more likely to assault someone. And so drunk sex puts men at risk of assaulting someone. And then the other point that I would make is that because students of color tend to drink less than white students, there is so much that we could say about preventing assault in the context of drinking. But if we only focus on intoxicated assault, then the prevention work that we do is more likely to help white students in a way that's really problematic. It leaves out the intimate partner assaults that are more characteristic of assaults among students of color.
Another one from the chat, can you speak about queer students or students who believe themselves to be asexual, and how does this play out in those populations?
In so many complicated ways. And I'm really glad that someone asked that question, because I realized that all my examples were cis hetero. So, I think about one student whose first assault happened before they came to college. They were genderqueer and so used the they pronoun. And they talked about doing a summer theater program in the big city near where they grew up. And it was the first space that they'd been in where there were non-cis hetero people. And it was like they had arrived, right? And so in that space, they were assaulted by an older man when they were drunk. And so it was the sort of situational power disparity of differential levels of intoxication combined with an age power disparity, combined with a socially produced power disparity. If they, I think their name was Charlene, if Charlene had grown up in a family that was accepting of their sex and gender identity, or had gone to a school that had a gay-straight alliance, they might not have had that same sense of desperately needing to find a queer space. So part of the vulnerability, because queer students do have the highest rates of being assaulted on campus, and part of that vulnerability, again, is socially produced. It has to do with our failure to create a landscape in which everyone can thrive. And then there are additional complications on campus that there's not one cause of the much higher rates of queer assault in the same way that there's not one cause of all sexual assaults, but many different factors come together to produce those higher rates.
Another one from the chat that actually sort of dovetails with something I wanted to ask you. When talking about community failure, how would you relate the ideas of sexual citizens to the Jewish community standards of being gender segregated, not touching, not really receiving practical sex ed until they get married, until the Chatan Kala classes? I guess that's a question about more sort of Orthodox communities.
Yeah, I feel like that's a little bit outside my lane to speak to that part of the Jewish community. I mean, you know, 20 years ago taught sex ed at the Temple in Atlanta. I've always felt like there is space in the Jewish community to take these issues on and to form, you know, it's a double mitzvah on Shabbat, right? Like everyone knows that. And so I think that there is a sex positivity in Judaism that we can leverage to prepare young people in an affirming way, in a sort of values-oriented way that is different. Like the sex ed that they can get in secular school, I don't necessarily want some random teacher communicating their values to my kid, right? I want you communicating your values to my kid, or our shared values to our kids. So I feel like I'm not so prepared to speak to the other sectors of the Jewish community. I feel like we're extremely well positioned to do this work.
Yeah, how else we in BJ, so there's the work that some of us in the teen program are doing around consent, around healthy sexuality with some of the older teens, but are there other ways that BJ as an institution can like be part of this fight?
I mean, I think that parents feel very underprepared to have these conversations with their kids. I personally think that reading the book and having your kid read the book is a good start, because it allows you to have a conversation that's not about what your kid has done, but to say like, that story with Gwen, I found it kind of troubling. What'd you think? But I think that, you know, sort of follow-up work by somebody who does work with parents to help them become more comfortable. Or I think there's like a lot of people don't feel comfortable talking with their kids because maybe they didn't themselves have such good sex education. And so I think and I think it needs to start much younger. I mean, the messages, like when you say to your kid, don't grab, use your words, that's sexual assault prevention, right? So I think that the idea that it has to start when they're about to have sex, no, it has to start like the first time your kid masturbates, it's your job not to shame them, right? And like, you need to use the words for genitals, because if you never mentioned elbow or neck, like that teaches somebody that elbows and necks are unspeakably shameful. So I think that supporting parents of much younger children to not produce shame. And then, you know, I'm a big fan of the sleepover, not of experiencing it, but I think as a concept, like when your child is in an intimate relationship and they're an older teenager, and you've said to them all along, I want sex to be for you something that is about commitment and showing care, not just showing who you can hook up with. Like, you need to be ready for them to call your bluff. And it is awkward to make them coffee the next morning. Like, I will own that. But I also think that there is really no more powerful message that signals to your kid, this is what it means. This is where sex belongs, in a loving, committed relationship, not in a backseat or on a park bench.
Yeah, I think acknowledging your child's sexual citizenship and the sexual citizenship of their partner in that same moment is like a really powerful sort of modeling, I think, of what you're trying to do. And what about on the like the legislative level? I know you're involved in Panim at BJ. Is there like a sort of a more bigger picture political angle that we could get involved with?
Yes, I mean, the religious right has done real damage in America in terms of creating this patchwork that we have of misogynist, you know, many states having misogynist, homophobic, abstinence-only sex education. And so I think that they're really, in the same way that BJ and other progressive religious organizations played such a powerful and effective role as the progressive religious left in standing up for marriage equality, I feel like, you know, I'm very disappointed that we don't seem to have passed comprehensive sexuality education legislation this term. It really seemed like it was going to happen, you know, before COVID-19 struck, but we're going back in there next year. I mean, you know, this legislative session is not over, but I would love to see Panim take this on as a campaign again. And even just to have the rabbis be willing to like sign on to a letter saying that this is what's right, because by not by allowing this policy environment to continue, we're basically saying like, we'll take care of our kids, but the kids who are poor or kids who are rural, like they're on their own. Their problem is not our problem. And really, like, what have we seen? Like, we're all bound up together, right? So their problems are our problems.
Absolutely. Another one from the chat box about this issue of sexual geographies. How can colleges and universities sort of reshape these spaces without having to literally, you know, like tear down buildings or do gut renovations? Like what does it look like?
So, I mean, the one thing that we didn't, we had a very large interdisciplinary team. We did not have an urban planner on the team, but I remember taking a tour through the Columbia dorms, and you know, the kids are so hardworking, and so many of the lounge spaces had been turned into study spaces. And we turned to the student who was touring us around and said, "What's the most fun thing that's ever happened in this space?" And he said, "Well, I guess that was when they brought the therapy dogs in." And I thought, my heart broke into like a million tiny pieces. And so I think common spaces that are furnished with all the charm of like an airport waiting room don't facilitate, you know, socializing in a fun way. And I think that the kids don't always know what's best for them. They need spaces, they need like shitty couches to sprawl on, right? And instead, so many of these lounge spaces are furnished with like armchairs with little desk attachments. And so I think just sort of reimagining that space in a way to let a different kind of socializing flourish. Like most of the furniture in these dorm lounges, you couldn't even sit with somebody on because the armchairs are so organized to be like places to study by yourself and be productive. So two changes that Columbia made in response to our findings, which I think show like how easy it would be to reimagine space. So one of them is that they changed the policy in a cafeteria. So now it's open all night. So if you think, you know, before students were sort of funneled back into bedrooms that had 4 pieces of furniture, right? A desk chair, a dresser, and a bed. And so they pretty much had to sit on the bed, and beds have sexual meanings. And so keeping JJ's open all night. And it's not like French fries are gonna prevent all assaults, but it just changes the opportunity structure. So students have a different place to go to be together. So that's one example. And another is that there's so many student activity groups, and it used to be that the student activity groups could reserve the lounges in the dorms. And like, imagine how you would feel if you got home at the end of a long day and somebody was holding a meeting in your living room, right? Like that would really not be warm and friendly. And so I think sort of reimagining the balance between activity and productivity and the need for sort of spontaneous recreation and socializing. Like both of those are changes. Neither of those changes really cost very much money. It's not about tearing down the dorms and rebuilding them. It's about thinking about how you can just use what you have differently. Another big triumph was the use of the lawns. So apparently there's a very devoted, I hope I'm not insulting anybody who's on this chat, but there's a very devoted lawn contingency in the Columbia alumni network who want the lawns to be beautifully pristine at all times. And that means having a lot of time to recover in between when people walk on them. And so we're like, why are people not playing Frisbee on the lawn all the time, right? That's what lawns are for. And so we were delighted to see a couple of years ago at orientation, after we had shared these findings with our administrative partners, that student orientation included a festival with a bouncy castle and like all these giant carnival things that were smushing down the grass. And we were like, go humans, boo grass. Because you could see that the university was really like leveraging what they have. There's not a ton of space on the Morningside campus, but they were managing it with a clear commitment to student well-being.
When I talk with parents about some of these issues in my work with their kids, there's a lot of concern about sort of this generation of kids who've been brought up with the internet, with social media, dating apps, hookup apps, the easy access to pornography. So a lot of the things you've been talking about tonight are problems that have existed since the beginning of universities, or since universities went co-ed. But what about kids today? Is there anything that you learned that sets them apart? These sort of media savvy, this internet generation.
The kids today.
The kids today.
I mean,
I can finally say that. I'm old enough.
Right. I love the kids today. The kids today are having less sex than their parents did. So we should not be so quick to judge them, or if we judge them, it should be with feeling sad that they're not having as much sex as their parents did. So, that's well documented. That's not our research. That's national representative population research. But I do worry about pornography because I think it teaches a very unrealistic and confusing message about what to expect from sex. There are porn literacy curricula, which I love, and I don't fool myself that like any school system anytime soon is going to adopt, porn literacy. It basically teaches young people to apply the same critical media literacy skills that they get in many middle school contexts, but to thinking about pornography, that people are paid actors, they're not really enjoying it, and so I think that we can't put the porn genie in the bottle, right? We can't that was part of what ticked off the Arab Spring, right? Was when they shut down the pornography. So like, we can't get the kids to stop watching porn, but what we can do is provide them with other sources of access to information. Like, I think we have to remember that partly they're watching porn out of, wanting to stimulate themselves sexually, but partly they're watching it because they're really hungry for information, and we have chosen to deprive them of information. So I think that we can provide alternative sources of learning to balance that out. I think that for grownups, it feels very scary for the idea that kids meet each other on apps, right? That feels like impossibly exotic. But just to break it down a little bit, mostly they don't meet complete strangers on apps. Mostly what they're looking for is someone who's like on the fringe of their social network, because when young people leave for school, their friends become substitute families. And so they don't, for the most part, actually want to get in an intimate relationship with a friend, because most relationships go sour. And the thing that they passionately want to preserve is the integrity of their friend network. So they want someone who's like the friend of a friend of a friend. So they're sort of a known quantity, but if it doesn't go anywhere, it won't ruin their friendship. So I think that like there are lots of things to worry about young people, but I don't think that Tinder is necessarily one of them.
Good. All right.
You could take that to the bank.
Thank you. And there's a number of stories in the book that are the stories from assaulters themselves, and not just stories of victims. And I'm wondering what it was like to hear those stories, and what did you learn from those stories, and why it was important for you to include those stories in the book.
I mean, those are voices that we don't hear, or if we hear them, it's from people who are so unconcerned with the possibility that they might harm anyone that they're impossible to hold any empathy or compassion from them. So like Eddie, for example, he started out his story, I put on a tie, so I knew I was going to have sex. And then he recounted this evening like as if he were the aggrieved person. He was invited to a sorority formal. He wasn't super into the girl, but it was a really high prestige sorority. So he went, he was in season. He was a competitive athlete. He had an early practice. He was not drinking. He really wanted to get to bed. He wanted to like go to this formal, get to bed. But she like kept going. She like drank a lot. They went to another place. At the end of the evening, it was pouring down rain. He didn't really know what to do with her. He didn't want to like just, drop her out of the cab because she was too drunk. She couldn't walk into her own dorm room. So he brought her back to his own room, and then didn't really want her in the bed, but didn't know where else to put her. And so then this is so disturbing. He recounted to us, in his words, having sex with her as she went in and out of consciousness. So like, that's assault. right? Like, and he should have gotten the memo. Like that's laid out pretty clearly in the freshman orientation. Like if somebody is too drunk to give consent, like, but he was in a mindset of having been invited to this sorority formal and that he somehow owed this to her as part of the evening, because if students don't explicitly agree to go as as friends platonically, then the evening is supposed to end in sex. And so he felt like he was just paying his debt, and she didn't seem to experience it as an assault, because we interviewed her. We didn't usually interview dyads, but we happened to interview her, and she recounted an assault, a totally different experience that she had had. And I think it's important, like the people who didn't show up to be interviewed in a study about sexual assault are, the Brock Turners, right? The people who are really like intentionally harming people, because why would they come tell their story when they knew that it was something that was wrong, right? But it was striking how frequently the people who did tell us their stories, they thought that they were having sex, right? And so for us, the big take home from that is that there are we see these as like the low-hanging fruit of sexual assault prevention, right? Like these are young people who have not been taught how to have sex without hurting other people. And we could do better, right? So like sitting in judgment on Eddie doesn't help us. We need to sit in judgment a little bit on Eddie's family and Eddie's community that he grew up in. It's all of us. That is really the big takeaway from the book, is that the prevention, you can't just be angry at institutions of higher education. The prevention, it's everybody's job.
And I think that that's one of the things that's been so detrimental about some of the way the discourse around sexual assault is the idea of these predators who are stalking campus and like preying on people, when that lets us off the hook, that lets all of us off the hook when we say these are irredeemable, bad people who are, out to abuse as many people as possible, when it's, it's children that we, young people that we might otherwise think of as good people who make who have been misled or make a series of miscalculations. There's alcohol involved, and I think that the holistic step back that your book takes is really edifying, sort of breaking that down and getting rid of this myth of that the real problem is these bad actors who are stalking around campus, because it's all of us who have allowed this problem to persist.
I mean, certainly, I don't ever want to be understood as not asking people to take responsibility for their own behavior. So when Lucy said stop, Scott should have said okay, not it's okay. So I think that there's always a role of personal responsibility. But if that's all we do, if all we do is say to people, wear your mask and otherwise you won't get sick, like we have to think about the whole system. And yet that's where the book is going, towards to a much broader vision of prevention.
I have one more from the chat. Did you have any moments in hearing the stories and talking to the students where you heard insights that came directly from them about what they needed or how they're managing? This person's asking because they're struck by how each generation does seem to be more sex positive and often teach the older generations. I'm hearing all the ways we failed them and your recommendations on how to better support them, but I'm just curious about how the back and forth went in terms of the students and their suggestions for solutions.
I mean, the students were very passionate in telling us their stories. And I mean, I'll never forget Diana. Can I tell you her whole story? Because it just has so
Please.
Up with me. So she was really curious about sex in high school, and she wanted to get good at it. And so she put an ad in Craigslist, and she would meet up with men, adult men, in hotel rooms. But she had rules, like anybody who sent her dick pics, they were a no. And they had to be able to put together a grammatically correct sentence. And she was clear, like no intercourse, and she was lucky that nobody ever pushed her boundary on that. And so it was like she practiced it like it was an SAT flashcard kind of thing, like where you just do it a lot and then she didn't understand that it was sort of a partner specific behavior. And so then when Diana got to college, she experienced a couple of troubling experiences, but then the one that I want to fast forward to is the time that she assaulted her gay best friend. She they would sort of like joke around and drunkenly make out, and it was all like fun and games. And then at one point he said to her, I think I'm moving down the Kinsey scale for you. And she was like, damn, that is the hottest thing anyone has ever said to me. And she really, like, he was joking and she misunderstood that. And she developed a whole plan to move him up the ladder to sex. And then she ended up assaulting him. And they talked about it afterwards. And he was like, yeah, I didn't want to do that. And when she came in to speak with me, this is one of the interviews that I did, her head was shaven and she looked like a penitent. And she described herself as asexual. And she was so unresolved with what she had done. And she looked at me and she gripped her armchairs and she said, I want you to tell Lee Bollinger my story. Right? And so I think that part of, like, students wanted to feel heard because of mandated reporting, which requires faculty to connect students to the option of adjudication if they become aware of gender or sexual misconduct. Students aren't able to share their stories with faculty, and that's a whole other conversation whether or not that's a good thing or not. But so students don't have a way to filter their stories back to the university so that their experience can serve as the basis for policy making. And so I think this goes back to your question of how we ended up, how students shared these stories with us. They were hungry to share stories with us. We, at one point, sent out an email to the entire undergraduate student body about the survey, and people wrote back to this anonymous survey email address saying that they had a story to tell. And they came in because they wanted us to bear witness. They wanted to feel heard. So I think more than them having solutions was their passion to just have their stories acknowledged, to have their suffering acknowledged. They wanted to feel, as many people do when they've experienced an assault, they wanted to feel seen.
And the story you just told about this woman who sexually assaulted her gay friend, that brings up this question of like men's experience of sexual assault. We don't hear as much about that. I'm wondering what your findings were around that.
So it's much more common. An assault covers all non-consensual sexual contact, so not necessarily penetrative intercourse. But I mean, by the time they graduate, the Shift survey found that 1 out of 3 women and 1 out of 6 men had experienced sexual assault. And, so in some cases, it's, men, particularly Black men, having their penises grabbed in bars, right? Which, again, I think you can only really understand in the context of the racial domination. But for some men, it's women not understanding that just because a man has an erection doesn't mean that means that he wants to have sex. And so there were stories that men told us of, a woman, so Rick, who was a cowboy, like he was like the sort of prototype hegemonic masculinity, told this story of a woman plying him with drinks all night. And he got very drunk and she took him back to his room and they had intercourse, and he was in no condition to consent. And he was very confused by that because he didn't know if a man could be assaulted. He didn't even know how to label it. He was clear he didn't want to have sex. He was clear he was in no conditions to provide consent. But and I think part of this is sort of what students have learned from sexual assault prevention is that men always have to get consent. And so when we forget that both people actually have to get consent, and that sex is not something that men get from women, and that in sort of like a Jane Austen novel where women's only job is to say yes or no, but sex is something that people have together. So there's both men and women in these heterosexual encounters are so in a narrative where men do the asking and women do the blocking or the admitting. And so it's hard for them to even imagine that sex that a woman forces on a man is assault, and it is.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think that we're so attached to our sexual scripts that we've inherited from the media, from our from our parents that says, you know, the man advances and the woman either acquiesces or blocks. And that's a really just an incredibly harmful and unproductive way to go about that. I guess I'm wondering, we're sort of reaching the end of our time, and I'm wondering if you had any, like, if there was anything that we didn't ask that you wanted to say, or if there's something that we haven't covered that you think is important to leave people with.
I mean, I think shout out to BJ. Like, I'm so proud to be part of a community that I feel like is doing part of this work, and in particular the work with the kids I've experienced, you know, through my own sons, you as such an incredibly powerful leader. And I think that it's people's parents, like, it takes a lot of grown-ups in someone's life to make the transition to adulthood. And so I think that we need to be those grown-ups for each other's kids, right? So I just really gratitude to you, to BJ, for doing the work. And I look forward to expanding the conversation. And then yes, of course, everybody, please buy the book. So
yes, I was going to say, how do we get the book? Are you available to talk about the book in people's book groups, and what's next for you and for the book?
Yeah, so you know, Seamus and I thought that the hard work was writing the book, but it turns out that the hard work is the social life of the book. And so this is, you know, we're doing 4 webinars a week, all month, and that includes large, like many thousands of people things, but it also includes, you know, we're available through our website to join people's book clubs. That's actually super fun. Like, people are like, really, the author? And I'm like, yep, that's us, the authors. So we're eager to get the word out. I feel like this is it's a conversation that can literally save people's lives. I've gotten such incredibly touching notes from students who read the book, and they're like, you know, I feel so seen in what you wrote. And so I think that helping people feel seen and helping people think clearly about, you know, we're in this sort of pause moment, right? And so in this pause moment, I think particularly for high school seniors who are stuck at home, they missed their prom, all that fooling around that they were going to do this spring didn't happen. Like, read the book this summer with your kids, talk about it with them, help them be ready to launch in a different way so that they can really think about what they feel good saying yes to and what they want to say no to.
And one of the things we were talking earlier this week about the book, and one of the things you told me is that you wanted it to be as sort of an optimistic and productive a book as possible about this subject. And I really felt like there's a lot of really harrowing, difficult stories in the book, but the overwhelming message that I was getting is that we can do better. It's within our power. Can you just talk a little bit about that, about how you made that sort of, how you balance that and sort of leave the readers with that imperative and that message?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of the conversation around sexual assault is grounded in fear of what will happen to kids, but also fear of young people's sexuality. And I think that, you know, our vision, like, we got this, we could do so much better. And this is 100%, it is the most optimistic book about campus sexual assault that you could read. Like, it's the first chapter, the one that describes all the assaults, is hard, but there are parts of the book that are funny, and you will hear my voice in it. So we really tried to give a sense of not just of sex and sexual assault on campus, but life on campus.
Thanks. Is there any more questions from the chat, or if people want to unmute themselves, want to open it up? The last 10 minutes.
So many familiar faces.
Waving.
Waving. Hi, everyone.
I actually have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, excellent.
So I'm assuming that high school is a good place to start. So would it make sense for us to, you know, speak to the PTAs, or, you know, to kind of get you, like, is it better for you to speak to the parents or to speak to the kids?
Both. I mean, I actually, one of my first stops on the book tour was at, if you can believe it, the Sacred Heart School in Palo Alto, California, because I have a friend who's an English teacher there. And so she invited me in, and I did a workshop with the parents, and then I spoke with the 11th and 12th graders, and then they adopted the book in their 12th grade English curriculum and used it to read Tess of the D'Urbervilles critically. And actually, a student recently made a YouTube video about the Twilight books, evaluating the Twilight books through the lens of sexual citizens and saying, like, what was Bella's sexual project, and what, you know, how did, so I think, yes, high school, Seamus and I would like to spend a lot of time visiting high schools in the fall. We'd like to go anywhere at any point, right, to get out of quarantine. But I think that high school is really the perfect, you know, 11th and 12th grade is the perfect age for kids who are thinking about sex to be having these conversations. I think it's a potentially a heavy lift in public schools because of the complexity of public schools, but like there are a number of public school districts outside the city that we're in conversation with, and there are many independent schools that are starting to have picked the book up and are requiring it as teacher training. So hopefully, just like we'll hit enough schools and it will really catch fire. Because I think you're right. It's before college is when we need to have these conversations.
Yeah, and my son is at a New York City public school, and I am happy to speak to the PTA and to the head of guidance there to see, you know, if they would at least, very least, talk with you, because I do
That's
think.
great. I think, you know, PTA book clubs, we were supposed to speak to the Brooklyn Tech PTA and be part of their book club in the fall, and then it's hard to know like what life is going to be like. But yes, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Great. Anyone else? Final questions or thoughts?
So if you have thoughts, share them on our Facebook page. You can always find us on Twitter. You can email us. We are everywhere. And this is really like what we're doing is a social life of the book. So we love to be in conversation. Seamus brings a whole other level of awesomeness to the talk. So come find us. And thank you for taking the time. I know you could be, I don't know, watching Tiger King instead. So
thank you, and thank you, Jennifer, for the book. It's really a profound and amazing read, and so many incredible ideas. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Larissa, for making this happen.
Thanks, Larissa.
You.